Friends, could I call you to order, please? It's a great delight to welcome you here to this, the second National Cathedrals Conference, and we're immensely grateful to the hospitality of this Tyneside Diocese and this wonderful cathedral of Newcastle for everything they've done to make our stay as enjoyable and as pleasurable as it can be. Let's begin with a prayer. Would you please stand? Thanks be to God for safe journeys, for the gift of these 4 days together, for everyone who's helped to make this conference possible. Thanks be to God for the callings and tasks God has entrusted to us, for the dioceses and communities we serve, the opportunities that are before us, the gifts and treasures we have inherited. Thanks be to God. So let us offer this conference to God, that God's will, love, and mercy may speak to us afresh. A prayer adapted from the writings of Oscar Romero. Send us your Spirit, Lord, with the gifts of humility and understanding. Teach us that your kingdom is not only beyond our efforts, but even beyond our vision. Give us the comfort of knowing that nothing we can do will be complete. No statement of ours will say all that can be said. No prayer of ours fully express our faith. No confession of ours bring us to perfection. Make us content to plant seeds that will one day grow, to water seeds that others have planted, to accept that their promise may be for the future, to lay foundations for others to build on better. Give us the comfort of knowing that we're merely workers, not master builders, ministers and not messiahs. And with your grace, prophets of a future, not our own. All this we pray in the name of Jesus the Lord. Amen. Please be seated. Well, here we are in Geordieland, party central, when even in midwinter, people dress to go out for a good night out as if to the beach in Ibiza. This is also the cradle of Northumbrian Christianity, where the mission of the Northumbrian saints influenced our nation. The influence of Aidan on Lindisfarne led to the evangelization of our nation in much of its northern and midland complexion. Think of St. Ced, St. Chad, St. Cuthbert, the work of the godly thug Wilfrid. That's a dig at Ripon. And on the other side of the Tyne, the founding of the great monasteries at Jarrow and Wearmouth. I won't burden you with lots of notices now, but the welcome desk over here will want to help you if you've got questions. We'll return to the rationale of this conference later on. But it's been a great delight that we've been able to bring together a whole kind of constellation of star speakers, and none greater than our opening act of Sir John Major. Sir John, we're very, very grateful indeed that you've come to be with us. He will be well known to all of us, and he in his time has appointed or nominated his fair share of deans and bishops. He had to preside over the first Gulf War when he first came to office, and his own style and values have permeated much of what he's done. I remember feeling rather relieved when in part of his first announcement as Prime Minister was that he had a desire to have this nation being at ease with itself. I like that very much. And we're very grateful to Sir John and his successors for helping to heal the wounds of Northern Ireland, helping to right the economy after booms and blips, and the achievements we look back on with some fondness, a style of politics that perhaps we long to get back to. Now, we've asked Sir John to be frank with us. He has to be in New York this evening for dinner, so he's on a very, very tight time schedule and must be whisked away just about 5 to 3. There will be time, of course, for questions, but please, would you make him welcome? And the floor is yours, Sir John. Thank you.
Well, Adrian, thank you very much indeed. I must say it's a delight to be back in this lovely cathedral. Though unless my memory fails me, and at my age it often does, the last time I was here I spoke from the other end of the cathedral. So, as you say, different country, different church, different stance. But the theme of your conference is our national story through the ages. Both church and country have always evolved, but I think rarely as fast as they do now. So I am now out of public life, away from partisan influences. But as an observer, I would like to offer some thoughts about the future. And it seems appropriate in this setting, perhaps above all, to turn firstly to the church. Now, our church faces many dilemmas in a society that has grown to distrust authority and is drifting towards secularity. There are those in our nation who prize celebrity, wealth, and fame more than values once thought to be inviolate. And this cultural change presents an extraordinary challenge to a church that does have eternal values. It's both a threat and an opportunity. But if the opportunity is to be taken, the church must be bold in its actions and outspoken about its concerns. When I was born, my father was very elderly. And from the time I was 9 years old, losing his sight and mostly bedridden. My mother cared for him, but very rarely left our home. But the church came to us in the form of our local vicar, the kind and gentle J. Franklin Cheney. And my elderly and sick parents lived by the precept that God was in our home every day, and so we had no need to go to his home once a week. Now that was a trite and self-serving excuse. But the Reverend Cheney just smiled and taught me as a boy that our church is far greater than simply the size of its congregations. People who are not regular churchgoers can still and still do live by Christian principles. Some people turn away from religion because, as someone put it to me, science is daily destroying the biblical bases of faith. But science can't replace faith. It can't remove the hope and the comfort that a perfect being can exist. This is a belief we share with other faiths, and men will cling to that hope until the last of our kind is extinct. The Reverend Cheney told me, echoing, I think, Thomas Aquinas, though he didn't tell me that, the Reverend Cheney told me that the best argument for Christ's divinity is that without the support of secular power, he changed the whole world. So he did. So far, for 2,000 years, no military conqueror has ever made such a mark on our lives, nor, I think, ever will. And if biblical stories, often in parable form, seem unrealistic to modern ears, the lessons they teach and the ideals they preach are not. They continue to appeal to the better selves within us. They're a protection against the worst that our material world can throw at us. The kingdom of God, we're told, is within you. We should be grateful for that. The alternative is selfishness, disorder, and the advance of savagery. In our world of change, the church can offer stability. Many changes in our world are beneficial, but by no means all of them. Sometimes change leaves values behind. And in the bustle of change, where stands happiness? What value is put upon peace of mind? Some argue all sorts of mysterious and curious things. But should we stand by silently while vile opinion is lauded? When truth is disposable, when authority is mocked, when tradition is trashed, when bad men hold sway in many countries? I think not. It may be unfashionable to speak of values, but it shouldn't be. They should never be cast aside. Our churches today may be fewer in number, and they may be less full than in years gone by, but their pulpits still have a distinctive voice. Millions of people wish to hear that voice used loudly, clearly, and often, either to uplift hearts and smooth away despair, or, where necessary, to speak out on issues that depress or oppress our fellow citizens. A single voice can easily be shouted down, but the church cannot. Some people argue passionately that the church should, I quote, keep out of politics and stick to promoting faith and filling their pews. If by politics the critics mean partisan party politics, then I agree. But if they mean politics in its wider sense, then I emphatically do not agree. The church mustn't be pushed into the sidelines of life. It must be alive in our communities, in our discourse, in our daily concerns. Politics, above all, is about how we live. That cannot and should not be ignored by our church. Is not the state of our nation politics? Are not our values politics? How can it possibly be argued that the church should be silent on those issues? Is not poverty about politics? Yes, it is. And surely the church must speak about that too. Jesus most certainly did. And if any part of our nation is lost or forgotten by authority, then surely the church should be a voice for the weak and for the voiceless. And above all, the church must remain the ultimate sanctuary for those in despair who in our modern world are too many in number. What we are as a nation and what we stand for is a legitimate issue for the voice of the church to be heard, and that voice must carry to the faithless as well as the faithful. But if it's to deliver its message, the church can't ignore its own problems. I won't trespass on this occasion upon matters of conscience, but only on practical issues. Many parishes face financial challenges, and there's a doubt about whether a nationwide parochial system can be sustained. It is, of course, a Herculean task. The Church of England, with its cathedrals and its parish churches, is responsible for a very large part of our architectural and cultural heritage, including no less than 45% of all Grade 1 listed buildings. The lion's share of that cost, the cost of maintaining this huge community asset, falls on the diminishing number of regular worshippers. This is both unjust and, in the longer term, unsustainable. Some argue that it may be necessary to close churches, reduce the number of stipendiary clergy, and sell assets. I do hope not. It would be a grim outlook, and I hope Christians will rally to prevent it. Churches are not only part of our lives, they're also a very important part of our landscape. If lost, we would all be the poorer. And by we, I don't only mean churchgoers, I mean everyone. I live in Eastern England, and John Betjeman's famous lines come to mind. What would you be, you wide East Anglian sky, without church towers to recognize you by? Whether we choose to acknowledge it or not, the church is always there when needed. And it is, it seems to me, more than simply a place of worship. It's where we may seek the comfort of community, of companionship, of solace, and of sanctuary. Often silently, perhaps even subliminally, the church is a guide to our lives and our conscience. We should be grateful for that and do everything we can to protect its place in our society. Let me now turn to the future of our country. And first, I think it might be worthwhile to set out some context. We are an island geographically, but in no other way. Our lives are interconnected with and affected by the wider world. We have alliances for security and trade deals for economic welfare. At the moment, our world is not in a state of grace. Not every nation is led by men and women of good intent. Democracy has fallen back. Freedom, or indeed freedom of religion, has not grown and spread as we would have wished. We live in uncertain times, times in which, if good men are complacent, bad men will take advantage. In countries where democracy is absent or weak or merely under strain, nationalist and populist sentiment has taken root and has grown. I don't like populism. Populism is self-interested and can be unscrupulous. It makes promises that can't be kept, creates division, scapegoats minorities, and controls or threatens or undermines the judiciary itself. Populist leaders favor obedience over ability. Acolytes and sycophants are rewarded. Dissenters are abused and, where possible, crushed. And the electoral system, if it seems likely to be necessary, the electoral system itself is perverted. All this is a corruption of a free society, and even the strongest of democracies must guard against it. In our country, we view authoritarian governments with distaste and implicit rejection. They are alien to our way of life and alien to our instincts for freedom. But not everyone in our world feels the same. There are many who have a quite different view. In England, in 1763, Lord Chancellor Henley said, and I quote, "If a man steps foot in England, he is a free man." Today, under the pressure of numbers, if that man is a refugee in a rubber boat, he receives a chilly welcome and the threat of deportation to Rwanda. I cannot believe that is the right way forward. Such a policy is not a moral advance, and I hope that the government will look again at this policy. We need a policy that is Europe-wide to contain people smuggling and to help the miserable and unfortunate victims of this trade. I do understand and sympathize with the government's difficulties, which are very real. But however you look at this policy, it is wrong. Wrong to forcibly transport people to a faraway land when all that most are seeking is a better life. That, after all, is what everybody here today would seek for themselves and their own families. So I hope, in their own interests, the whole Cabinet will reject this policy. If they do not, they will stain not only their own reputations, but that of the entire government, and most important of all, of our country, for a very long time. Our shortcomings may be far less than others, but pragmatic self-interest tells us we cannot simply ignore autocracies. On arms control, on climate change, on counter-terrorism, democracies and autocracies must work together or we will all lose. The more we divide into tribes, the more likely it is that we will end up coming to blows. 30 years ago, we glimpsed a better world. The Soviet Union, an autocracy and dictatorship imploded. Germany was reunited. Apartheid was ended. Democracy spread right across Eastern Europe. The liberal order appeared to be dominant. It looked, in those days, as though our values of democracy, of freedom of thought and deed, had won the battle of ideas, and that our way of life would become accepted as the general ideal. It was a time of hope. We were naive, complacent, horribly wrong. We forgot the human capacity for folly. We see that now vividly, day after day, taking place in Ukraine. Freedom needs eternal vigilance. Democracy has to be protected. If it is not, it can be overwhelmed, value by value, freedom by freedom, country by country. In the United Kingdom, two block-busting events will affect our future. I refer, of course, to Brexit and COVID. Brexit has not presented Britain's best face to the world. It's our modern-day break with Rome, in this instance, the Treaty of Rome, and it will take years for all the implications to become apparent. Some will be positive. Far more, I believe, will not. Some applaud Brexit for reasons of democracy and sovereignty. Others deplore it on economic and social grounds. The debate was rancorous and factually dubious. Brexit divided our four nations and our politics, as well as family from family and friend from friend. If Scotland and Ireland secede from the United Kingdom, Brexit must bear its own part of the blame for that schism. The severity of COVID was surpassed only by Spanish flu a century ago. It seems a long time for it to come back. Like Brexit, COVID was enormously expensive. I have made no secret that I believe that leaving the European Union will, indeed has already, weakened our country and damaged our future. But I am a realist. It may not be conceivable to re-enter the European Union, should our country wish to do so, for many years. An early attempt to do so would surely fail and worsen the ruptures in our national political system. Nor could we rejoin upon the favourable terms that we once enjoyed. But attitudes to Europe may change. They may change when today's young, in due time, govern our nation. All the evidence suggests the young are overwhelmingly pro-European. If the promised benefits of leaving continue to be elusive, if not all but invisible, their resolve to rejoin may be strengthened. Until then, we must try and restore links with our neighbours where it is sensible to do so, and otherwise live with the consequences of our referendum decision. Brexit is emphatically not done. The effects of breaking away from the richest free trade market in history will seep out year upon year for a very long time. As for COVID, the government acted boldly in setting up furlough payments and swiftly to ensure the vaccine rollout. But there remain valid questions to be answered about advice to the public, about wasteful expenditure, about a lack of control over fraud, about the decision to transfer elderly patients from hospital to care homes, and the slipshod manner of awarding COVID-related contracts. A public inquiry has been promised and should not be delayed. At the very least, our country deserves an interim report within the term of this Parliament. Between them, Brexit and COVID have driven our national debt to previously unthought of heights. The cost of COVID is estimated as equivalent to 1/4 of the total cost of the Second World War. Over time, estimates suggest the cost of Brexit could be higher yet. It took decades, literally, to repay the debts of war, and it will take many, many years to repay the cost of Brexit and COVID. And this raises an unwelcome question. How can we pay for future policy ambitions? Demography ensures that the mega budgets, health, education, social care, will increase year on year. Our national security requires that the cost of defence is going to rise too. So also will the costs of climate change. and the plans to level up communities in an effort to end historic injustices. Some people deny the existence of climate change with exactly the same fervour with which our predecessors once insisted that the Earth was flat. But the evidence can't be put aside. Sea levels are rising on over 70% of the Earth's surface. Storms, hurricanes, floods are increasing in number and in severity. The Arctic is warming twice as fast as the rest of the planet. Across the whole globe, the weather is freakily unpredictable. We are losing whole species of plants, animals, insects. We all know the litany, and I needn't spell out any more of it. Can we ignore all this? No. Can any one nation alone overcome this? No again. Dare we leave this for the next generation? No, yet again. It would be wrong in principle, and in any event, it may by then be too late and the burden too great. And nor can levelling up our communities be ignored. There are serious inequalities in our United Kingdom that have built up over many decades. For many years, governments comforted themselves that if our country as a whole was doing well, the wealth would trickle down from those at the top to lift up the poorest. Well, it hasn't happened. It hasn't done so. Of course, there have been improvements, but not enough, not nearly enough. In times of austerity, we are told that I quote, we are all in it together. If so, then logic suggests we should all be in it together in times of prosperity as well. I hope the government will seek to devise a policy that encourages trickle down and shares national growth more fairly in the future than it has been shared in the past. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying here. I'm not favouring some bash the rich policy. Wealth in our country is important to us all. We should welcome investors and innovators as job creators, as philanthropists, as taxpayers. But as a nation, once the wealth is built, we need to be fairer in distributing the fruits of national growth. You'll all remember the key workers for whom we stood applauding on our doorsteps during the COVID crisis. They were mostly poorly paid. There was no trickle down to them, and yet it was they upon whom so many of us depended in a crisis. Our values need a bit of levelling up as well as our communities. But we must be realistic. Levelling up is the right policy, beyond a doubt, but it will take many parliaments to complete and will only succeed if future governments buy into the concept and the cost. How can all this be paid for? There are options. It could, over time, be met by above-average growth in our economy. That is possible, but we cannot rely upon that. If growth is insufficient, which experience suggests is probable, the cost can only be met by higher taxes or more borrowing or cuts in other budgets. It's an unwelcome truth that lower taxes for everyone and higher spending do not readily go together. Hard choices must be made. And some hard choices must be made without delay as inflation rises, especially on food and on fuel, while growth falls and stagflation threatens, as it does at the present time. Many people will be utterly unable to meet the bills that lie ahead. Help must come, and I hope that it will come soon. As it does, it may help to bring trust and respect back to our politics. Electors must have trust in the state, the government, and the independence and impartiality of the law. But if the nation is to be loyal to the state must be loyal to the people. And that is why the provision of quality public services is so important. Everyone needs to believe that the state cares about them and not just the interests of the powerful, the motivators, and the elite? If the streets are unsafe, do the people who live in them believe the state is invested in them? If the week lasts longer than the money, do the penniless believe the state cares about them? If children attend a poor school with disillusioned teachers, do the children or the teachers feel protected and valued by the state? It is important that they should do so. In our democracy, we rely upon one another in nearly every aspect of our lives. We need to respect and protect those with whom we share a common dependence. There is much that is good in our way of life that no previous generation has enjoyed. Personally, I know of nowhere else in the world. I have traveled frequently for many, many years. I know of nowhere else in the world where I would prefer to live than in my own country. Every day, every single day, medical science is improving treatments of cancer and blood diseases. New knees and new hips can help those crippled with pain. The cure of cataracts can restore sight. Help is on the horizon for sufferers of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. Not an outright cure, perhaps, but an ability to diagnose them early and stop them in their tracks. We are not short of good Samaritans in our society. The caring professions do not walk by on the other side, nor do the millions who work for charities or volunteer for them or donate to them. There is hope in two irresistible social changes. The rise of women to prominence in nearly every field of endeavor is as staggering as it is overdue. We are at last utilizing the skills of half our nation that were hidden away for far too long. It's odd, isn't it? Throughout the ages, men have trusted our most treasured possessions, our children, to women. But we have not trusted women to contribute more widely to society, and at times have positively prevented them from doing so. Yet they bring a moderating and restraining force, generally, to a world that is in need of those attributes. There's another human influence I wish to mention as an overall force for good, and I refer to the young. They have grown up in a different world to their elders. They think differently. They are unburdened by the old shibboleths that have so framed the lives of those of you of my generation and generations quite close to mine. We may be wary of their music. We may not be entirely in favor of their dress-down style, their habit of cutting holes in the knees of new jeans for the sake of fashion. I've no doubt that past generations baffled their parents in similar ways. But the legacy we leave our young includes problems. But from all I've seen, this is a good generation. I have high hopes for them. I have enough confidence to believe that however much longer I may live, my country will be in good hands with our young. And beyond that, for me as a Christian, the greatest consolation is that one day I may be in even better hands still. Both our country and our church are more precious to our very being than most acknowledge or realize. Are they different now than in the past? I think they are. Will they be different in the future? Of course they will. For as the world around us changes, so too will they. But our country and our church are eternal, and my hope is they will remain shining beacons of goodness and decency in a world that at this moment is badly in need of both. Thank you all very much. You now have the chance to get your own back.
Yes.
Now time for questions.
So are there questions? There's one here. Can we have a roving mic down here, please? Just to the front row, second row. Would you like to introduce yourself before you ask your question?
Hello, it's Graham Warren from Coventry Cathedral.
Sorry, where are you? Oh, there, right.
Thank you for your lectures. Very interesting, wide-ranging thoughts about the state of our country. But there's one aspect which you didn't touch on, which strikes me very strongly, that the world in which I grew up, and you, I guess, grew up, you're around about my age group, was very different in terms of ethnic, religious background than what we have today. You know, I never met anyone who was, you know, people were called Mohammedans in those days. You know, I never met anyone from another faith. I never met anyone with a non-white skin until probably I was 18 when I went to university. You know, I lived in a very homogeneous society. I wonder what you think about the sort of society we have now, and it's very noticeable in Coventry that you walk around the city centre of Coventry and Newcastle, excuse me, and you see enormous range of young people from all sorts of countries and all sorts of backgrounds, and I wonder what you think that diversity, what effect that diversity is having on the way we go forward as a society. Sorry, that's a very wide-ranging question. But
Yes. Well, we have 2 or 3 days to address it. I don't mind the diversity. I mean, I have spent a very great part of my life either working overseas in other countries, Nigeria, the Far East, places like that, or traveling to them at any stage. And the diversity of instinct, the diversity of religion, essentially in most cases comes broadly back to the same questions and the same answers. We may have different religions, we may have different instincts, but the basic human instinct, it seems to me, of the people I've met is pretty much similar. So I think I'm fairly content about the direction in which we are going. It is becoming more difficult in many ways for people to navigate the changes that are apparent. Whereas a whole country may have been wholly Christian, you now have a country like ours that embraces many religions, with people who are just as devout to their religion as Christians are to their own. I think that is the whole diversity of humanity. I have no particular problem with that. I think we can embrace that. The importance is to try and bring it together where we can, and I think that is more a job for the churches than the politicians. I think the churches are more likely to be successful in that than the politicians. We politicians, I speak as an ex-politician, very much an ex-politician, but we thrive on diversity often rather more than agreement. But I think that is not true of many of the religions. And I have no objection to the diversity that we're beginning to see. I think in diversity there can be strength, providing we can iron out the foolish squabbles and differences that have so often arisen in the past between different religions. It's not easy. It requires men and women of great ability to be able to do that, but I think it is doable. And I think we do live in a world that is diverse and is likely to become more diverse, and we had better get used to it and make the best of it.
Thank you very much. There's a question at the back from the BBC, I think.
Sir John, yes.
Where are you?
2 points from your
sorry.
your speech. You're speaking, of course, in Newcastle in the northeast, which I think a lot of people here will agree is the best region in the United Kingdom, but then we're biased on that. Now, you know that although that is the case, we have in our region some of the least money spent per head on transport. We have some of the worst health outcomes. We have the highest unemployment still. You say in your speech that levelling up will take many parliaments to complete. Doesn't that mean that our region is doomed to stay behind for many years? And one more question, if I may, Sir John. You say that Brexit divided our 4 nations and our politics. It also, of course, gave us, in the fallout of Brexit, the Northern Ireland Protocol. Is the Prime Minister pursuing the right plan, given the difficulties, Sir John, with that protocol?
I think on the first part of your question, there's a lot to be changed and to be improved in terms of levelling up the levels of opportunity and choice and quality of life in different parts of our country. This has grown up for a very long time, not because I think past governments of any party have been particularly disinterested in people enjoying an equality of well-being, but simply because some of the methods they chose simply have not been as successful as we thought they would be. But I think it's now evident that the disparities of well-being that exist in different parts of our country are too wide to be tolerated. And I think there will be, whomsoever is in government over the next 10 or 20 years, I think you will see solid moves towards a levelling up of the quality of life in different parts of our country. And I very strongly welcome that. I think it is the right policy. I don't think, if I may say so, that previous governments have been heartless and uncaring about different parts of the country, but I think some of the solutions that they tried have been, shall we say, less successful than they might have been. And I hope we have learned about that in the future. There is a great deal to be done because there are great disparities in our country. I think sometimes people are not aware how great the disparities of quality of life may be in different parts of our United Kingdom. And we do need to address that. And for some that will be painful, for others it will be a relief because we will see a greater degree of prosperity coming into their direction. I think that is necessary. I think it is taking hold within the body politic that is necessary, and I hope it's something that we are going to see. Sorry, remind me of the second part of your question.
The second part of the question.
As one gets older, one forgets so quickly.
The second part was that you mentioned that Brexit, Sir John, had divided our four nations and our politics. Part of the fallout of Brexit, of course, was the Northern Ireland Protocol. And I wondered, in your opinion, is the Prime Minister right now in Northern Ireland now pursuing the right plan, given the difficulties with that protocol?
Well, it may surprise you to know this, but I don't know what the Prime Minister is doing today. It is a mystery to me what he's doing today. But he might be pursuing exactly the right policy, but I really don't know what his objectives are at this moment. But I do think we have generally to look at the differences and difficulties that apply in different parts of our country and see the extent to which we can smooth out the difficulties in one part of the country by a contribution perhaps from time to time from other parts of the country. I do think the inequalities that exist, nobody meant to create them, but events have created them for a variety of reasons, some of them good, some not so good. And I think there is a necessity to try and minimize those disparities. And anyone who seeks to do that will deserve and enjoy my support.
Thank you very much. Sir John's spoken eloquently of the role of women. We haven't had a woman ask a question, so I'm going to be biased. There are two women here. Would you like to ask your question first? Would you stand up and tell us who you are?
My question might not be as good as the next question, but my name's Nikki Wynne. I'm from St Paul's Cathedral. And thank you very much, Sir John, for talking to us about our different country. You really did summarise very well what we've all been going through, particularly for the past 2 years. And it's affected every single church throughout the country, particularly the larger, more expensive ones. And here we are this week. We've got a wonderful week together looking at different country, different church. Each one of us with a different agenda looking at that different church. And I was wondering if you could give us some of your thoughts on, how do we survive as churches moving forward in such a different country that we are today, given the stretches and strains as well on congregations, on making sure that the church's buildings still survive. Thank you.
Well, there's no doubt that in practical terms, the church faces a great many problems. I don't think there has ever been a time when you couldn't have said that. And it's certainly true at the present time. How should it develop? I think there is an argument that there is often heard about the church, that it should keep out of secular matters. It should not interfere. It should concentrate just upon examining its religious aspect and caring for the faithful and encouraging others to be faithful. I think the church has to be a part of the community. I think the church has a perfect right to speak out where it sees injustice and to support things that is right and try to push those forward. The church needs to be involved in the community in every conceivable way. That doesn't mean the churches necessarily have to be full, because we live a different life from the one we did when they were at their fullest quite a long time ago now. But the church has to be relevant to what goes on today. It has to speak out. It has to ignore those people who say to the church, you shouldn't do this. You should restrict yourself solely within the realms of religion. The church is about bringing good to the community. You can add to good decency, equity, anything else you like. The church, in my mind, should be in the business of improving people's lives in every conceivable way they can. And the church has a voice, and it seems to me the church must use it. It isn't always convenient to governments of any particular sort, not just this one. I better make that point before it's misunderstood. It may not always be comfortable, but I think the church has a responsibility to speak out and make itself relevant to the lives of people who face great difficulties. And they need to know sometimes that people will speak up for them, so that they will care for them. Church mustn't lock away as though it's in a little enclave which marks religion, and we must talk about it here, but we mustn't talk about it outside. The church has to be involved in the communities, and it has to speak up for what it sees to be right, not in a party political sense. That would demean the church. I don't think the church should go out in party political fashion, but I think it is perfectly right to use its voice to speak about what it sees to be necessary and what it believes to be right. I have no objection to them doing that, and I think it would be healthy if they did.
Thank you very much. There's one other question just here. Thank you. Can you tell us who you are?
Thank you. Catherine Percival, Portsmouth Cathedral. Sir John, thank you very much for your very wise and encouraging words. And I suppose a related question to the last one, really. Is decency enough? And is there any way in which you'd like to see the church speaking out in non-traditional ways on maybe different subjects from those for which we're known?
Thank you.
Is decency enough? Well, decency is essential, but I think maybe not enough. You can be decent and you could be passive, and the church isn't always passive and shouldn't always be passive. I think that is certainly the case. It's difficult to draw a line that isn't misunderstood. Should the church get itself deeply involved in political controversy? I don't think that actually helps the church. Should the church get deeply involved in matters that affect the way people live, if people are living in distress, then I think that they should. The church has a voice, has literally a pulpit, and I think on issues of national importance it is credible and desirable for the church to speak out, not in a partisan way. I'm not advocating the church should take up political cudgels one way or another. I don't think that would help either the church or the nation. But I think it does need to speak out on some issues, long-term issues, and occasionally, if it wishes, it can speak out in support rather than in opposition. That is also helpful from time to time, because people advocating political ideas, or I should say social ideas rather than political, often need the support that the church can themselves offer them. But the church needs to be careful. If the church gets itself involved in purely partisan squabbles, it will not enhance its position in our country. But if it should speak out on matters of relevance to the way people live and what is happening to the quality of life, then I think that seems to me to be entirely a proper thing for the church to do.
Thank you. A question there at the back, and then Mark Russell. Okay.
Hello. Sir John, thank you very much. My name is John Goddard. I'm a Professor of Regional Development at Newcastle University and a member of the Council of this cathedral. You referenced the Levelling Up agenda. There's a Levelling Up white paper, which I think is 350 pages long, going all across Whitehall. Not a single reference in it to the role of the churches, not a single reference in it to the role of universities. Why is it you think that Whitehall, and I'm not saying Whitehall should get involved in churches, does not see the role of churches, cathedrals in cities, parish churches as key instruments of delivering some of its objectives? Thank you.
Well, I, of course, have not been in government for 25 years and have not been in Parliament for over 20 years. So I don't claim to be entirely au fait with the thinking of those people who are in Parliament. But it is quite a difficult proposition for the politicians as well, if I may speak up on their behalf for a moment. It's not in the instinct of the politicians to try and politicize matters relating to the church in any way. I think they tend to keep away from that. And I think that is probably desirable. Once you begin to mix church and state without drawing a clear delineation between the two, then you muddy a great deal that it is better to leave alone. So I'm not at all sure there is an easy way to respond to your question. And I am in the fortunate position that I am no longer in politics, and I no longer need to have an answer to every question that is asked.
Oh. So, John, that was a politician's answer to a difficult question. Mark Russell, down here. Mark will be contributing tomorrow.
Sir John, before I ask my question, I want to say a thank you. I wrote to you as a 14-year-old boy after a Semtex bomb went off on my road in Northern Ireland, and you sent me a handwritten letter back and told me to watch this space. And not long after, you signed the Downing Street Declaration with Albert Reynolds that led to the peace process that led to the Good Friday Agreement. So I want to say, as a kid from rural Northern Ireland, I want to say thank you for getting your arms deep in the most intractable problem in the British Isles. Thank you. My question, in my day job, I'm chief executive of the Children's Society, which is one of the largest children's charities in the country. I was so pleased to hear you talk about the value of young people. Like you, I profoundly believe in young people, in their resilience, in their optimism, and their hope. But as our team know, life is too hard for too many children. We know that children's mental health is in crisis. We know that 1 child in 3 lives in poverty in this country. What advice would you have to the government to turn that around so that we can invest in our young people and help them be the leaders that our country needs today and tomorrow?
Crikey, you have several hours. It is an extraordinary... thank you firstly for your kind words earlier. It is extraordinarily difficult to answer that question in any detail without actually going into the most intimate of details about exactly what we should do. There are a whole range of extremely serious problems that we need to deal with. And we are now, at this very moment, sailing, I suspect, into some quite difficult economic weather over the immediate future. And it is going to be extraordinarily difficult for any government to navigate some of those difficulties that are about to arise. I do think with the problems that you outline, we need to look not at some short-term solution that will ameliorate them. We do need a reassessment of what are the priorities of what we actually wish to achieve in our society. And as far as possible, it would be helpful, and I hope I'm not whistling for the moon, it would be helpful if we could get some sort of concordat between the main political parties as to the general direction in which we would go. They may achieve the same outcome in a different fashion, for that is politics, and politics thrives on disagreement and the proof that you are right and they are wrong, and has done since the dawn of time and will continue to do so. But I think when you can identify long-term problems like that, it is worth looking to see if there is a communal solution that can be carried forward over a very long time indeed. And I think there are areas where that undoubtedly can be done. But I don't think glib answers on the hoof are at all the way. We need a proper examination of what the underlying problem is, how the underlying problem has arisen. That is usually pretty well known. But then looking at what policies can be put in place that will ameliorate those problems. And I suppose the point to make in defense of the politicians, often the right policy is a policy that will not bear apparent fruit in the short span of time between one election and another. Which is why I think where you can reach a degree of cross-party consensus on policy, it is a very wise thing to be able to do. We have been able to do it on some subjects in the past. And I think as we identify long-term problems, and problems that are really quite intolerable, and we have some in our country, then I think the degree to which you can get a consensus in Parliament is a good idea. Consensus, in the view of some politicians, is weakness. Consensus, in the view of other politicians, and I would include myself in their number, is strength, because it will ensure the continuation of a policy that is absolutely necessary. And every country in Europe, not just us, but every country in Europe has degrees of inequalities and particular problems where politics gets in the way of a solution. And I do think a little more of a concordat between the parties where it is possible as to how to deal with problems would be a great advance for our country at the present time. There are lots of problems. Some of them are problems that have arisen and no one perhaps could have foreseen them or how serious they would be. Others are perhaps more evident how the problem has come about. But to look at them, if you possibly can, over the longer term, and with some form of consensus. Consensus is not a weakness. Consensus is a strength. If you can reach out and reach a consensus view with other political parties, then the policy upon which you can agree can continue between elections, between the popularity and dismissal of governments, which is a natural part of our system. And I think we have to do that. I know I'm speaking in the generality rather than the specific, but it's in the generality, in the thought processes of how you approach those problems, that we're going to find a solution, if indeed we can find one.
Thank you very much. There is one other question over here. So, John, are you game for another two, and then we can draw things to a conclusion?
Depends what they are.
Yeah. I think they'll be short and pleasant, yes. All right. So that's a clue. Short and pleasant.
Thank you. I'm Kaya Burgess. I'm religious affairs correspondent at the Times newspaper. You mentioned Northern Ireland and Scotland as part of your speech in your section on Brexit. Mark talked about the Good Friday Agreement. Do you think the Prime Minister and ministers are right or sincere when they say there's a need to renegotiate parts of the Northern Ireland Protocol in order to protect the Good Friday Agreement? And do you think the EU is likely to think they'll be doing that in good faith?
Well, it might depend which bits they have in mind. I'm sorry if that seems evasive, but if you spent the whole of your life, as I have, looking at detail rather than generality, you do begin to sniff the air a bit when you get a question like that. Because without digging down into the detail of what is actually proposed, it's actually quite difficult to answer that question honestly. And if you answer it generically, you're going to find yourself probably quite quickly in quite deep water. So I think, if I may, I'm going to opt out of that, because I can't offer you an answer that is safe. And I can't offer you an answer without further delineation that I'm confident of. I don't like doing that, but I'm going to.
Thank you. There's another question. Was it over there? Oh, here. Sorry.
One of the advantages of not being in politics is you don't necessarily have to answer a question where you can see you're going to get it partly wrong or insufficient. And these days I have that luxury. Wonderful.
Yeah.
So, John, hello. To your left.
Oh, could you
Dave Crown,
tell us who you
Peterborough
are?
Cathedral, just up the road from your good self. Hopefully I'll get the tone right for you to end on a big high. I was delighted to hear you talk about equality, and frankly, this country, I think, is much better for its diversity and its multicultural pattern. And I'm particularly delighted that you talked about the power that women absolutely rightly should have in society. I find myself a little disappointed, however, that the first woman Prime Minister of this country found her statue, let's say that she was for turning and had to come away from London and find her home in her home of Grantham. I wondered what you might think about that and what perhaps Baroness Thatcher might have thought of that.
I'm sorry, I missed the bit just before the end. Would you say that again?
I wondered if you might comment on the fact that Baroness Thatcher's statue has had to be homed in her hometown and not in Westminster, where she made such an impact.
Well, of course, it should be out amongst the public. People can be very controversial in politics. Indeed, it's difficult sometimes in your political life to avoid being controversial, because there are very different approaches to some particular problems. But if we get ourselves in a position where if you disagree with someone, their statue, presumably not in their own lifetime in most cases, their statue is defiled or in some danger, then we've reached a level of intolerance in our country that is extremely objectionable. And I think we should try and guard against that. Politics is about having different ideas. Sometimes at the outset, those ideas are very controversial because people haven't gripped. They're different from the way they have always thought. It's a new idea. But sometimes those new ideas happen to be right. We do need people who will think outside the box, provide something entirely new, which may be completely dismissed in the short term. And gradually, people begin to see that there is some virtue in that idea, and they move towards it. Now, if we lose the tolerance, I think on balance, I know of no country that is more placid and tolerant in accepting political views than this one. I think it goes wrong occasionally and you get riots or whatever it may be over a particular policy. But if you look down the decades, we are as placid in accepting changes of policy, I think, as any country that I can myself think of. And I think that is very attractive. By and large, I think the electorate think, well, elect the rogues for 5 years and we'll think about it again in 5 years' time. And I can think of worse ways to run a democracy than that. So I am always offended if I see the legacies to people who've served in public life in any form removed or damaged. It seems to be an intolerance that is inimical to the way most people in this country think and act. And I hope it always will be, because it is usually possible in the United Kingdom to become fairly close to a consensus on many issues once the case is fully explained. And I have to let you into a deep and dark secret. Often the disagreements between the main parties in Parliament are much less than they seem when you hear what is said, because people will draw out the differences to make a case, draw out the differences in order to do damage to their opponents. But in terms of seeking a consensus, on many issues, there is a much greater consensus between the political parties that many people outside politics would themselves imagine. And you soon discover that in private conversations within politics. It's not universally true. There are some people on the different fringes of politics who are forever looking for disputes rather than agreements. But that is not a universal view. And the extent of agreement, you do need diversity, because you get agreement on everything and you placidly accept something that is wrong. So you do need grit in the oyster. You do need people who say this is wrong and I'm going to oppose it. But by and large, there's often a much greater degree of consensus on many issues than perhaps the electorate themselves would imagine. I personally welcome that.
Thank you. Sir John, we'd better let you get away because you have a plane to catch. But before you go, really do want to say a profound thank you for preparing so carefully and giving us the distillation of your political experience and how you've tried to live your political career and the contribution you've been making to the world order since you left full-time politics. I think many of us are also grateful for the plain speaking that you indulged in when you were in office, and perhaps also the way you left office. You know, that there were more things going on in the world than the game of politics, and you went to see that king of sports, cricket, the day you left office. And I think that says a lot about you. And I was also, as a person who likes to use Saxon quite often, I was very, very appreciative of your exasperation with some of your colleagues in Parliament when you doubted their paternity. And I think it's good always. It's good always to be able to speak your mind. And thank you for speaking it so freely and so frankly today. We're enormously grateful.
Thank you.
Have a safe trip.
Thank you very much.